My parents blew nearly $438,000 of their retirement savings on my brother, then showed up at my house expecting to move in, only for me to discover he had used their money to fund his condo, pay old debts, and treat my home as his backup plan. My parents told me they were moving into my house while a moving truck was already parked in my driveway. Dad stood on the porch with 2 suitcases and said the arrangement would be temporary, probably 18 months. Mom walked past him, looked toward the stairs, and asked whether my home office or my 8-year-old daughter's bedroom would be easier to clear out. I asked what had happened to the $438,000 retirement account they had shown me the previous Christmas. Dad said, "We invested it in Dylan's future. Now it is your turn to help the family." Dylan was my 31-year-old brother. He lived 6 miles away in a newly renovated condominium with 2 empty bedrooms. Yet he had told our parents he could not house them because his business needed a calm environment. Then Mom handed me a folder labeled Family Repayment Plan. The first page said I would provide housing, utilities, groceries, insurance copays, and $1,500 a month until Dylan's company repaid them. There was no repayment date, there was no signature from Dylan, and the address listed as collateral for my parents' investment was not owned by Dylan's company at all. So where had nearly $500,000 actually gone? And why had my parents risked everything for my brother while treating my home as the asset that made their risk possible? I was 36 then. My husband Jonah was 38, our daughter Sophie was 8, and we lived in a 4-bedroom house outside Columbus. Calling it a 4-bedroom house made it sound more spacious than it was. 1 room was ours, 1 was Sophie's, 1 was my office, and the smallest was a combined guest room and music room where Jonah taught guitar lessons twice a week. We had bought the house for $417,000, with a 20% down payment we saved over 9 years. The mortgage, property taxes, and insurance cost $2,840 a month. We were comfortable, but not wealthy. Jonah was a physical therapist. I managed compliance for a regional bank. We funded retirement accounts, Sophie's college plan, and a 6-month emergency reserve because both of us had grown up watching money emergencies become family emergencies. My parents, Alan and Carol, seemed even more cautious. Dad was 65 and had worked 38 years for a packaging manufacturer. Mom was 63 and had been a public school librarian. They owned a modest house with a $146,000 mortgage and had approximately $438,000 in retirement savings, plus pensions and Social Security. Their plan had always been simple. Dad would retire at 66, Mom would work until 65. They would sell the house, buy a smaller townhouse, and use their retirement accounts carefully. Then Dylan opened a restaurant. He called it Forge and Field, an upscale farm-to-table place in a converted warehouse. Dylan was charismatic and genuinely talented at creating an experience. He knew lighting, menus, music, and exactly how to make investors feel they had discovered something before everyone else. He did not know inventory controls, payroll taxes, lease negotiation, or the difference between revenue and cash. The restaurant opened 18 months before the moving truck appeared. At first, it looked successful. Local magazines praised it. Dylan posted photographs of full tables. He told us reservations were booked for weeks. 3 months after opening, he asked Mom and Dad for $40,000 to add a private dining room. He said the money would be a secured loan repaid within 1 year at 8% interest. My parents asked what I thought. I reviewed the 2-page agreement Dylan had created and told them it was not secured because it did not identify collateral, a repayment schedule, or what happened after default. "You investigate everything until it stops feeling like family," Mom said. Dad gave Dylan the money anyway. The private dining room opened, but repayment did not begin. Dylan said construction overages had delayed it. Then he needed $28,000 for a new ventilation system, $17,500 for a liquor license issue, and $36,000 for what he called a seasonal cash flow bridge. Each time, he described the request as the last barrier before profitability. I asked to see financial statements. Dylan sent screenshots from the restaurant's reservation system and said detailed numbers were confidential because other investors were involved. My parents treated full reservations as proof that he was thriving. The first major warning came at Thanksgiving. Dylan arrived in a leased luxury SUV and announced he had bought a condominium for $510,000. Mom laughed and said the bank would not lend that much unless the restaurant was doing well. I checked the property record the next morning. The condo had been purchased by Alder House Holdings, LLC. Dylan was not publicly listed as the owner. His girlfriend, Marissa, was the registered manager. Dylan said the LLC was normal asset protection. Dad told me to stop snooping. By January, my parents had withdrawn $112,000 from Dad's retirement account. The withdrawal triggered taxes and early distribution penalties because part of it came from an account Dad accessed before the eligible date under his plan. When I asked why they had not used the promised loan paperwork, Dad said Dylan's attorney was preparing one master agreement. That agreement became the family repayment plan Mom brought to my house months later, except Dylan had never signed it. The crisis accelerated in March. Forge & Field's payroll processor filed a notice for insufficient funds. Dylan told my parents a major catering customer was 60 days late. He said that if they provided $210,000, he could pay vendors, clear tax issues, and purchase the warehouse through a new company. Owning the property would supposedly reduce monthly costs and create collateral for every family loan. I begged my parents not to do it. If the warehouse is the collateral, verify the purchase contract and put your names on the lien before money moves, I told Dad. Dad said, "Your brother needs confidence, not a committee." Mom said I had always resented how easily Dylan attracted people. That accusation distracted me because it was partly true. Dylan had been the child everyone watched. When he struggled in college, my parents paid for 3 different programs. When I earned a scholarship, they treated it as evidence that I needed less. I had spent years telling myself independence was not neglect. Hearing Mom reduce my concern to jealousy made me want to step away entirely. So I did. I told them they were adults and could make their own decision, but Jonah and I would not fund the restaurant or guarantee any debt. Dad replied, "Nobody is asking you to." 5 months later, the moving truck arrived. My parents had withdrawn almost every dollar from their retirement accounts. After taxes, penalties, and market losses caused by selling at a bad time, they transferred $367,400 to entities connected with Dylan. They also stopped paying their own mortgage for 4 months because Dylan promised a repayment was coming. The bank began foreclosure proceedings. Instead of calling me, my parents signed a short sale agreement and moved their furniture into storage. They assumed our house was the next step. I did not let the movers unload. Mom stood in my driveway and said, "You have 4 bedrooms. We gave you every opportunity to succeed." I reminded her that Jonah and I had paid for our house and that 1 bedroom belonged to their granddaughter. Dad said, "Dylan cannot take us because investors visit his condo. Your house is stable. That is how families balance things." Jonah quietly took Sophie to a neighbor's house. Then he returned and stood beside me while I told my parents they could stay at a hotel for 7 nights at our expense, but they could not move into our home. During that week, I would help them find an attorney, a financial advisor, and temporary housing. Dad called the offer humiliating. Mom called me ungrateful. The truck remained in the driveway for almost an hour before the driver warned that waiting time was billable. My parents finally redirected it to storage. That evening, Dylan called me. "Just let them use your guest room," Dylan said. "The restaurant is closing a financing round. I will have them out soon." I asked why he could not use one of his empty rooms. "My investors would see it as instability," Dylan replied. I said, "Then your investors are seeing the truth before Mom and Dad are." Dylan hung up. The next morning, I took the family repayment plan to an elder finance attorney named Rachel Kim. My parents came only because I said the hotel would not be extended unless they met with her. Rachel reviewed the plan and asked for bank statements, wire confirmations, tax returns, restaurant agreements, and the warehouse purchase documents. Dad had only wire receipts and emails from Dylan. The collateral address in the plan belonged to the warehouse. County records showed it had not been purchased by Dylan or any company he controlled. It was still owned by the original landlord. The $210,000 supposedly intended to buy it had been divided among 4 recipients. $78,000 went to Forge and Field. $65,000 went to Alderhouse Holdings, the company that owned Dylan's condo. $42,000 went to an older restaurant investor. $25,000 went to an account labeled M. Vale Consulting, controlled by Marissa. My parents stared at the statement as though the numbers might rearrange themselves. Dad said Dylan must have structured the purchase through the LLC. Rachel explained that paying the owner of Dylan's residence did not create a security interest for my parents. We requested a complete accounting in writing. Dylan responded with a glossy investor presentation. It claimed Forge and Field had $2.8 million in annualized revenue and would open a second location. The presentation did not include debt, unpaid taxes, lease defaults, or cash on hand. Rachel asked my parents to sign an authorization, allowing us to obtain records directly. Mom resisted. "If we treat him like a criminal, he may stop trying to save the business," Mom said. Rachel replied, "A request for an accounting does not create missing money. It reveals it." They signed. The restaurant's landlord had already filed an eviction action. State records showed $186,000 in unpaid sales and payroll taxes. Vendors had judgments totaling another $94,000. Forge and Field's full tables were real, but the restaurant lost money on many menu items and had been using new investor funds to pay old obligations. The largest surprise involved Alderhouse Holdings. My parents' $65,000 transfer had not merely covered Dylan's personal housing. Their earlier $40,000 and $28,000 loans had also flowed through the company. In total, $133,000 of their money funded the condo down payment, renovations, and 6 months of mortgage payments. The condo deed named only the LLC. Marissa owned 90%. Dylan owned 10% through a separate membership agreement. My parents owned nothing. They had financed a luxury home for my brother and his girlfriend, then arrived at my house because the home they financed was supposedly unavailable to them. When Dad saw the membership agreement, he whispered that Dylan had promised the condo would eventually be sold to repay them. There was no written promise. I thought the evidence would immediately change my parents' position. It did not. Mom said Dylan had probably put the condo in Marissa's name to protect it from restaurant creditors. Rachel explained that hiding assets from creditors would create another problem, not a solution. Dad said business owners moved money for legitimate reasons. Then my parents asked whether they could move into our house while the lawsuit proceeded. I said no again. That refusal became the family story. My aunt posted that some children forgot who changed their diapers. 2 cousins messaged that I cared more about spare rooms than my parents. Dylan told relatives he had offered to repay everything, but I was forcing legal action. Dylan also created an online fundraiser called Help Alan and Carol Stay with Family. The photograph showed my parents standing beside the moving truck in my driveway. The description said an unnamed relative had withdrawn a promised room after learning that Dad needed cardiac monitoring. Dad did not have a heart condition. He took blood pressure medication and had mentioned an ordinary follow-up appointment. The fundraiser raised $7,840 in 2 days, mostly from restaurant customers and distant relatives. Dylan controlled the account. When Rachel demanded that the page be corrected and the money transferred directly to my parents, he removed the medical claim but left the accusation about me. I posted one response. My parents had safe temporary lodging, professional advisors, and sufficient monthly income for an apartment. I would not discuss their finances publicly. Then I saved screenshots and stopped answering comments. A cousin named Renee called after seeing my response. She worked for one of Forge and Field's produce suppliers. Dylan had told her company that my parents' house sale would guarantee every overdue invoice. He had also shown the supplier a letter describing me as a future guarantor once a family asset consolidation was complete. I had never seen the letter. It carried no signature, but it listed my employer, approximate salary, home value, and the last 4 digits of an old checking account that Mom had used years earlier when reimbursing me for a vacation. Dylan had turned private family information into the appearance of available credit. Rachel sent the supplier and Dylan formal notices that I had guaranteed nothing. The supplier's attorney then shared the document with the restaurant landlord. Within 48 hours, 2 more creditors contacted Rachel to confirm that my house and income were not part of Dylan's repayment plan. That was the first setback my parents could not explain as creative bookkeeping. Even if the restaurant recovered, Dylan had been selling strangers the same assumption he sold them. Natalie would absorb whatever remained. Dad asked whether the creditors could come after my home. Rachel said no because I had signed nothing, but warned that silence could have allowed the false story to spread further. Mom looked physically ill. "He said your name was only in the private family forecast," Mom said. I asked, "When did you learn I was in any forecast?" Mom admitted Dylan had discussed my income before they sold their house. He told them they could safely use the final $210,000 because, in the worst case, living with me would reduce their expenses to almost zero. My parents had not invented the moving plan after the money vanished. They had approved the investment partly because my household was already written into Dylan's downside scenario. That admission hurt more than the truck. They had not merely panicked and reached for their daughter. They had silently valued my labor, Jonah's privacy, and Sophie's bedroom before accepting a risk none of us knew existed. For 10 days, Mom and Dad stayed in the hotel. Then they attempted a different approach. Mom changed her mailing address to mine without asking. Dad had a prescription delivered to our porch. A storage company called to schedule delivery of 6 boxes. Rachel warned me that mail alone would not create tenancy, but she recommended a clear written notice. Jonah and I sent one stating that my parents did not live at our address, had no permission to move property in, and could visit only by invitation. Mom cried when she read it. "You are treating us like strangers," Mom said. I replied, "You planned to make us responsible before you even told us there was a crisis. Boundaries are not the part that made this impersonal." We found them a furnished 2-bedroom apartment for $1,420 a month. Their combined pension and Social Security income was $4,180, enough to cover rent, food, and basic expenses if they followed a budget. The problem was not immediate homelessness. The problem was that they had imagined my household absorbing every consequence so they would never have to change their lifestyle or confront Dylan. I paid the apartment deposit directly to the landlord. I did not give my parents cash, and I made clear it was a one-time gift. Dylan escalated after the accounting demand. He emailed Dad a confession that sounded carefully limited. He admitted using $65,000 for the condo, but said it was temporary collateral. He offered my parents a 5% interest in Alder House Holdings. Rachel reviewed the operating agreement. 5% would give them no control, no guaranteed distributions, and no right to force a sale. It would also expose them to future capital calls. Dylan was offering a symbolic slice of a company controlled by Marissa instead of repayment. Dad wanted to accept. "At least it proves he is trying," Dad said. I asked Dad whether he would accept 5% of my house after giving me $367,000. He had no answer. The situation finally changed when Marissa ended her relationship with Dylan. She locked him out of the condo and sent Rachel records to protect herself from the fraud claims. The records included text messages in which Dylan described my parents as his soft bridge and me as the hard backstop. In one message, Marissa asked what would happen when my parents ran out of money. Dylan replied, "Natalie has the big house and the bank job. They will land there. She will hate it, but she will not let them be homeless." That message was the hidden foundation of every request. Dylan had not merely hoped I might help. He had calculated my house, salary, and conscience as collateral for risks I never approved. Marissa also disclosed that Dylan had paid himself $84,000 in management fees while the restaurant skipped taxes. He used part of the money for travel, the SUV lease, and a watch. The older investor who received $42,000 was threatening to expose the restaurant's finances, so Dylan used my parents' money to buy silence. We held a family meeting at Rachel's office. I insisted it include my parents, Dylan, Marissa's attorney, and a neutral accountant. Dylan arrived 30 minutes late and began by saying the restaurant had been one refinancing away from success. The accountant displayed the cash flow timeline. Each of my parents' transfers appeared beside its destination. The first loans filled operating gaps. Later transfers funded the condo and repaid favored investors. The final $210,000 did not purchase real estate, create collateral, or save jobs. Dad asked Dylan why he told them the warehouse purchase was closing. "I believed it would close eventually," Dylan said. Mom asked why he assumed they could live with me. Dylan looked at me and said, "Because Natalie has always been the responsible one." That was the closest he came to admitting the plan. Rachel presented two options. Dylan could sign a settlement transferring his 10% condo interest, assigning claims against the restaurant, surrendering the SUV, and agreeing to a restitution judgment. Or, my parents could proceed with fraud, elder exploitation, and fraudulent transfer claims. Dylan accused me of trying to ruin him. Dad started to defend him, then stopped. For the first time, he asked Dylan a direct question. "If Natalie had let us move in," Dad asked, "would you have told us about the condo money?" Dylan did not answer. My parents chose litigation. The restaurant entered bankruptcy 2 weeks later. Its equipment sold for less than 1/3 of the value listed in the investor presentation. The tax authorities were paid first. Ordinary investors recovered little. But the condo transfers were documented well enough for a separate settlement. Marissa agreed to sell the property rather than litigate whether she had received fraudulent transfers. After the mortgage, fees, and her documented contribution, $148,000 was returned to my parents. Dylan's surrendered SUV and watch produced another $31,600. The restitution judgment covered the remaining amount, although Rachel warned that collection would take years. My parents did not recover their retirement. They recovered enough to stabilize their lives. They used $96,000 to buy a small 2-bedroom condominium with a manageable association fee. The remaining money went into an account managed by an independent fiduciary. Their pensions and Social Security cover ordinary expenses. I receive quarterly reports only because they asked me to, but I cannot withdraw money. For 6 months, Mom continued saying my refusal had been unnecessarily harsh. Then Sophie asked her why Grandma had wanted to take her bedroom. Mom finally heard the plan from the perspective of the child whose space she had treated as available inventory. Mom apologized to Sophie first. Then she apologized to Jonah and me. "I thought your stability meant we had permission to be unstable," Mom said. "We spent your help before asking for it." Dad's apology took longer. He had to grieve the version of Dylan he had financed. He now attends a support group for relatives affected by financial exploitation. He and I can discuss the numbers without him calling them an attack. Dylan moved into a studio apartment and took a salaried restaurant management job. He makes monthly restitution payments when employed and misses them often enough that Rachel keeps the judgment active. I have limited contact with him. He has apologized for the lie about the warehouse, but not for treating my family as his emergency fund. The fundraiser money became another small but important consequence. After Rachel threatened an accounting action, Dylan transferred the full $7,840 to the fiduciary account and paid the platform fees himself. My parents used none of it for housing. On the advice of counsel, the donations were returned when possible, and the remainder went to the local senior housing nonprofit identified on the corrected page. Dad personally called Renee's employer to state that I had never guaranteed the restaurant debt. Several relatives quietly deleted their posts. Only Renee apologized directly. She said Dylan's letter had looked official because it used the language of banking and family obligation in the same paragraph. That was how nearly every lie worked, a real fact about my career attached to an invented promise about my money. My parents have never lived in my house. They visit for dinner twice a month, and they stay in the guest room for one night at Christmas. The difference is that each visit is invited, planned, and temporary. I still wonder whether paying their apartment deposit softened a lesson they needed to learn, or whether refusing the moving truck was cruel after they had lost almost everything. But allowing them to move in would not have restored their money. It would only have transferred the cost of Dylan's choices into my marriage, my daughter's room, and our future. So, if your parents spent their retirement savings on your sibling because they assumed your home would catch them afterward, would you let them move in while they rebuilt? Or would refusing be the only way to stop the family from using your stability as collateral?